Ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Sands leaves a comment. On this video, Matthew Sands, who is a volunteerist, and he's working on the idea of establishing... Oh, okay, we'll get to that. That's funny. Oh, this is funny.
Hello, it's Matthew here from Nations of Sanity, and I'm doing a response video to Brandon Cropper, who's done 3 videos criticizing Nations of Sanity. I'm just going to do a little video going through his points here. I'm going to use clips from his videos. I will put the links to his videos and his channel in the description, so you can obviously see the full videos, but I'll just use little snippets to show the points that he made, and then I'll obviously give my responses. So here we go. And just to briefly introduce the Nations of Sanity to anybody who's watching this who's not familiar with it, the Nations of Sanity, the idea behind it is to create a truly free society where everyone has truly equal rights by establishing the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement, basically making it the terms of peace between all people. The peace agreement we present is specifically a 3-part peace agreement. And it's made up of part 1, which is the basic agreement to make the non-aggression principle the law. Part 2, which is called the lines in the sand, where we set limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. And part 3 is about agreeing rightful ownership, basically ratifying ownership through the non-aggression principle. So you have part 1, the basic agreement, make the NAP the law. Part 2, the limits of tolerance over differing interpretations, the lines in the sand, basically where we say there's grey areas here and there, but this is where you're definitely violating the non-aggression principle. This is where the line is drawn. And part 3, agreeing rightful ownership, ratifying rightful ownership through the non-aggression principle, because once you have that principle, it's pretty easy to define what rightful ownership is, who rightfully owns what, and how you can distinguish between something that's stolen and something that was acquired rightfully through creation or voluntary trade. So that's the peace agreement. And also, just to explain what the non-aggression principle is for anyone who's unfamiliar with that, basically the non-aggression principle is built on the premise of self-ownership and the concept that every person has right over themselves and only over themselves. And any violation of your self-ownership is a violation of the non-aggression principle, any act of aggression against you. And basically the non-aggression principle prohibits the initiation of force against peaceful people. It's not a pacifist principle. It's important that people understand that you can use force. You can use force to defend yourself, and you can use force to defend others. But the non-aggression principle strictly prohibits the initiation of force against peaceful people. So that's an important thing to understand. And that's what the Nations of Sanity is about, making that principle the law, the universal law, established through a peace agreement. And it is our assertion that this is the only way to create a truly free society where everybody has truly equal rights. And this is what Brandon had to say about it.
I think you're a moron who's about 3 inches away from being charged with treason by the FBI, which is on a hair trigger nowadays. That's what I think.
And just to give a little background to how this interaction began, I left a comment on one of Brandon's videos just explaining that attempts to initiate force and threats to initiate force are also violations of the non-aggression principle, as well as just initiating force itself. So that's how our interaction began. Brandon did a video replying to that. I also, in my comment, introduced the Nations of Sanity, and he had a few things to say about Nations of Sanity as well. So he did a video replying to that. I replied with a comment in the comment section of his video. He done another video replying to that comment, and then I replied again, and he did a third video. I did reply to the third video with a comment in that comment section as well, but we never had a fourth video from him. So I decided to do this video to respond to all 3 videos, more specifically the third and final one, and just to hopefully explain myself a little bit better and Also, just worth noting that I have invited Brandon to debate these issues person to person, which he has agreed to do. We haven't set a date or anything at this point, but I'm very hopeful that we will get something arranged and be able to debate and discuss this in more detail.
Matthew Sands says threatening or attempting to initiate force is also a non-aggression principle violation. So threatening force or attempting to initiate it. Now these are very legalistic ideas. You're going to have to put this down in law.
Yes, we are going to have to put this down in law, and that is what the Nations of Sanity is about. It's about making the non-aggression principle the law, establishing it as the law through a peace agreement. So it is the law, the terms of peace. Brandon doesn't like me using the term terms of peace to describe law, but as I do explain later, you're basically talking about the same thing. Whether you say terms of peace, whether you say law, you're basically saying the same thing. And I will explain why I use both terms later in the video. Now, this clip is from his first video. I did respond to this, and he did address my response in his second video. So I'm just going to jump ahead to his second video and play what he had to say about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, in the comment section of Matthew Sands, NAP, Voluntarism, Anarcho-Cap Nonsense. That's the title of the video that I'm reading the comment section of right now. Matthew Sands says, thank you for the response. First of all, oh, sorry, let me skip the next paragraph. That's just introductory. You seemed to be saying that my first sentence is stupid because such standards need to be set in law. Yes, I'm saying you need law. So why don't you just give up on this anarchist bullshit and just have a law? He says, but as you later admit, I propose doing precisely that through a peace agreement. Now, is this peace agreement a law or not? What is it? Is it a law or is it an agreement?
Okay, the peace agreement is a way of establishing the non-aggression principle as the law. So the non-aggression principle would be the law, or terms of peace, whichever phrase you like, but it will be established through a peace agreement. So it's the law established through a peace agreement.
If it's a law, then find a government to pass it and enforce it, because that's what a law is. That requirement is clearly not lost on me, so he recognizes he needs to make it a law. In fact, it is part of why I assert that the non-aggression principle needs to be established as law. I thought laws were aggression.
No, laws are not aggression. The law against rape is not aggression. The law against murder is not aggression. The law against theft is not aggression. I mean, people can still talk about how modern day police are funded through the theft of taxation, and there's obviously aggression attached to that, but simply having a law against rape is itself not aggression. Having a law against any kind of drug use, for example, or having a law against gambling or having a law against prostitution is aggression. And the difference is the law against rape is just a defensive act. It's a declaration of force on the contingency that you initiate force against somebody else. It's basically saying, you know, this is a declaration of defense. Whereas a law that interferes with your self-ownership is an act of aggression. So it's not that law is an act of aggression. Some laws are an act of aggression that exist today because they violate our self-ownership. This is also the difference, and I'll touch on this later, but this is also the difference between ruling people and not ruling people. Again, prohibiting somebody from rape, murder, or theft is not ruling them. Again, that's just defending yourself or defending others. But having a law that says somebody can't use whatever drug they want to use, or they can't sell their body, or they can't gamble, or that sort of stuff, that is ruling them. So this is a distinction that I need to make clear with Brandon and obviously anybody else who's watching this. This is the difference, and this is the point of having the non-aggression principle be the law, because enforcing the non-aggression principle is just an act of defense. Whether it's defending yourself or whether it's defending others, it's an act of defense, and everything the non-aggression principle prohibits is just it's just prohibiting you from initiating force against others for violating their self-ownership, their self-rule, or their basic freedom. Both me and Brandon do define freedom in this way, so this is a concept that he should be able to understand pretty well.
He says it needs to be established as a law rather than just being some floaty principle that different people interpret differently. Well, different people are going to interpret stuff differently. Let me promise you that. And that's why we have to have courts and judges and juries and lawyers.
Yes, people interpret stuff differently, which is why we need a universal standard. And that's the point of making the non-aggression principle the law through a peace agreement. And that is also why it specifically needs to be this three-part peace agreement, where you have the basic agreement established through part 1, and then part 2 deals with the limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. So we can understand that there's grey areas where reasonable people can disagree over precisely where we draw the line, but there is a limit. There is a limit to how much people's differing interpretations, how much they can push that, to make sure they don't push it into absurdity, to make sure that they do not infect the black and white with these grey areas. We have to have limits of tolerance over the differing interpretations. So that is a solution to that issue. People have differing interpretations. We have this principle, which will get most of the way there. Once people understand the concept of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle, they're most of the way there. But where we have these grey areas, part 2 is about setting limits of tolerance, the lines in the sand, as I call it, to mark out where we are saying for sure you're violating the non-aggression principle if you cross this line. And now we're jumping back to video 1, Brandon's first video, where we're still talking about the issue of threats and attempts to initiate force against people.
But the idea that people can use force to defend against non-aggression principle violations does not restrict them to after-the-fact responses. So you can act before somebody actually attacks you. You can do a preemptive action on people. And it does allow them to act in response to threats or attempts to initiate force against peaceful people. So you're saying that you would allow people to go out and attack people who have done nothing. But the person who goes and attacks them says that they feel like the person was going to do something. Okay? That's what he says.
No, you can't just attack somebody who's done nothing just because you said or you think or you feel that there's some kind of threat to you or you thought that they might do something. No, you can use force in response to an initiation of force or an attempt or a threat to. So if someone threatens you or attempts to harm you, you can use force against them. You don't have to wait until after they've actually assaulted you or robbed you or whatever the violation is. So I'm not saying that you can just attack people who have done nothing. I'm saying you can, and you're not attacking people, you can use force against people if they violate your self-ownership, if they violate your rule, if they aggress against you. Basically, if they violate the non-aggression principle, then you can use force against them. And violating the non-aggression principle isn't just restricted to initiations of force, it is also attempting or threatening to initiate force. It is also a non-aggression principle violation. So you can use force. If they violate the non-aggression principle, you can use force against them. And violating the non-aggression principle isn't just initiating force, but it is also if they attempt to or threaten to. They actually have to threaten to. If you just subjectively feel threatened by them in some kind of subjective way because they're big or they are carrying a weapon or something like that, then that's not enough. That's they haven't threatened you as an objective fact. So that's a distinction that's worth knowing as well.
Now he paragraph breaks and he makes a statement about himself. He says, I am a voluntarist, and I work on this idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as universal law. All right, who's going to be your police force? Where are the jails? Where are the courts? What's your document to back it up? Where's your constitution?
Okay, the peace agreement is essentially serving as kind of like a constitution. I mean, that's basically setting the rules for which we play. Just like America has a constitution that dictates how government can act, the peace agreement will serve like a constitution that dictates how everybody can act, including government. Although, and I need to speak to Brandon about how he defines government, because I define government as a ruling entity, and under that definition, government would be illegal under the non-aggression principle. But you can still have something like a government that doesn't actually violate the non-aggression principle, something that just enforces the non-aggression principle and protects people's rights and serves them in whatever other ways. And in that case, I wouldn't call that a government. If Brandon wants to call it a government, we need to talk about how we define government, because I define them as ruling entities. But the point is if the non-aggression principle is the law, then government itself as a ruling entity would be illegal. Government as what I would call a voluntary collective would be able to enforce the non-aggression principle and provide a lot of the other services and infrastructure that we associate with government. They just are not allowed to violate the non-aggression principle. The same law that would apply to us, this constitution, although it's, like I say, it's a peace agreement, but it would kind of serve similar to a constitution. It's basically, a piece of paper that's basically declaring what the law is, what the rules are. So, but yeah, that's basically what I'm talking about. The non-aggression principle will be established as law through this peace agreement, and that would serve kind of like a constitution. Another area of confusion between me and Brandon was this issue of how many people need to agree to this peace agreement. Now, there's kind of two parts to that question, because one is how many need to agree to actually make it the law, to actually realize this, so it's not just my idea but something that is actually established as law. And then the other thing is how many people need to agree for it to apply to them. Basically, when the non-aggression principle is established as law, it will apply to everybody, not just the people that agreed to this peace agreement, but it would apply to everybody. But we will need a certain amount of people to agree to actually establish it as law. So this proves to be an area of confusion between me and Brandon, but I just wanted to clarify that here and now, that's what I'm talking about. When I say about how many people need to agree to this peace agreement, I'm talking about how many people we need to actually establish it as law, to actually overthrow ruling governments or the rule of governments and replace their rule with this peace agreement that establishes the non-aggression principle as law. But once we've done that, the law applies to everybody. I mean, in fact, I would say that the non-aggression principle applies to everybody whether we've managed to establish it as law anyway, because it is a objective principle, it is a universal standard of morality, and once you have a understanding and acceptance of the basic principle of self-ownership, then the non-aggression principle becomes a self-evident objective standard for morality. So I say that the non-aggression principle applies to people anyway, but this peace agreement that we're looking to establish will apply to everybody, regardless of whether they agree, but we will obviously need a certain amount of people to agree to actually make it reality. Anyway, I made a lot of these points in my responses to Brandon, and he obviously addressed them in the following video. So that's basically pretty much all he had to say in the first video. I made a response, and this is what he had to say in the second video.
But continuing, he says, just to jump ahead to your comments about this peace agreement, ruling people is a violation of the NAP as it involves the threat of force. So we can't rule over people. All right. What does ruling over people mean? Or whatever, you just can't do it. It's a no-no. Bad, bad, bad. Don't rule over other people.
As I explained earlier when I was talking about whether laws are aggression or not, and what distinguishes a law that is aggressive, like a drug law or a gambling law or a prostitution law or something that interferes with your freedom as a self-owning individual, and laws that are not aggression, like laws against rape, murder and theft, because they're just acts of defense and ways of protecting rights rather than violating rights. And this is what ruling is about. This is how you define ruling as well.
So, the NAP cannot be established as a universal law through a ruling authority, like a government. It can only be established as a law through a peace agreement. He says law is basically the terms of peace. Well, what the hell are terms of peace? What is peace? Peace is what happens when nobody's fighting. What does that mean? That's a stupid sentence. That's the stupidest sentence I've ever heard in my life. Law is basically the terms of peace. That is officially the stupidest sentence I have ever heard.
I mean, I do respond to this, and I will show you Brandon's response to my response that he does in his third video. But basically, like I say, I stand by my characterization of law as the terms of peace, because that's basically what it is. I mean, if I say that you can't rape because it's the terms of peace that you cannot rape, or if I say that you're not allowed to rape because that's the law, I'm saying the same thing. You're not allowed to rape, and if you do, force will be used against you to stop you, or as a response if we're not able to stop you after the fact. So law is the terms of peace. Normally it's set by a ruling government. The government set the terms of peace between its citizenry, and unfortunately the rules don't seem to apply to them. But we can also establish it through a peace agreement. So it will be the terms of this peace agreement. This is an area of confusion between me and Brandon, but hopefully we can get to an understanding on what we're both talking about here.
Okay. Usually law is set by the ruling authority, like a government or a monarch, that base the law on their authority to rule others. No, they base the law on whatever they damn choose. They base it on whim. Their authority is based on their authority to rule others. What? Nothing's based on their authority to rule others. That's a nonsense sentence. Okay, next sentence. This idea is to establish the non-aggression principle as the universal terms of peace. Now he's invented this new idea of terms of peace. Why does he use the word terms of peace? Because it gets him away from the word law. Now they're basically the same thing, he says in this sentence. Law is basically the terms of peace. They're the same thing, but at least he doesn't have to use the word law anymore, which is a dirty word. Okay, so this idea is to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement. To establish it as the terms of peace through a peace agreement. But law. To establish it as a law through the peace agreement. Through a peace agreement where no one has the right to rule, because ruling people would be illegal. Now remember, don't rule anybody. Now what if somebody decides they want to rule others? Who's going to stop them? Who's the ruler that's going to stop them? What if someone decides they want to rule over other people? Oh, that's a no-no. You mustn't do it. Who's going to stop them?
Okay, this question of who is going to stop them, who is going to stop people from ruling others. I mean, basically what you're asking is who's going to enforce the non-aggression principle. Whether you're saying who's going to stop someone from ruling somebody else, or whether you're asking who's going to stop somebody from robbing somebody else, or from raping somebody else, or murdering somebody else, or assaulting somebody else, or whatever. Basically, you're asking who's going to enforce the non-aggression principle. We have it as law, we have it as the terms of peace. It's there, but who's going to actually enforce it? Now, the answer to that question is that everybody has equal right to enforce the non-aggression principle. Nobody has the obligation to enforce the non-aggression principle. The only obligation is that you don't violate the non-aggression principle. But everybody has the right to enforce the non-aggression principle. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone has the ability to enforce the non-aggression principle. And that means, I do think that we need to have organisations that are set up to enforce the non-aggression principle to protect people that can't protect themselves. So, you can have a kind of police force, for want of a better word, that enforces the non-aggression principle, but such an organisation doesn't have exclusive right to do it. They don't need to have any special powers or rights above anybody else, because enforcing the non-aggression principle, as I say, is something that everybody can do. It doesn't require any special powers or privileges, because that basic right of self-ownership allows you to defend yourself against aggressors, and it allows you to defend others. So we can, like I say, we can still have police, we can still have organisations that protect the rights of others. In fact, I very much want to create that. And I think that by establishing the non-aggression principle as law, that's how you can then transform governments into voluntary collectives that no longer violate rights, but only exist to protect them. So yeah.
It would be the capitalized terms of peace. Now remember, terms of peace means law. So the non-aggression principle would be the law. And it would apply to everyone, regardless of their agreement. All right, well, if you're just going to enlist everyone regardless of their agreement, then why the fuck don't you just use the system we have right now, which already enlists everyone regardless of their agreement? So you're offering no substitution and no difference from the current system we have. You're such a moron. Continuing, just as it doesn't matter if a rapist agrees to the law against rape, the law still applies to them. All right. So you're defining an objective law you're going to apply to and enforce on everyone whether they agree or not. That's what you just said right there. So with regards to how many need to agree to this peace agreement, I can't say an exact number. Well, you just said nobody needs to agree to it. You just said it doesn't matter whether they agree to it. You're going to enforce it no matter what. That's what you just said in the previous sentence. And the very next sentence, you don't say you're not sure how many people need to agree. And in the previous sentence, you said it doesn't matter if they agree. You're going to enforce it on them, whether they agree or not. And then you said you're not sure how many need to agree. Make up your mind. How many do you think would need to be on board with such an agreement to actually overthrow the current ruling authorities and replace their rule with this universal principle? I think you're a moron who's about 3 inches away from being charged with treason by the FBI, which is on a hair trigger nowadays. That's what I think. One final clarification on the peace agreement, which is worth knowing. I know I've written a lot already. Fine, it is a 3-part peace agreement which goes like this. Part 1, the basic agreement to make the NAP the law. So first of all, we enforce the non-aggression principle on everybody, whether they like it or not. Part 2, lines in the sand to set limits of tolerance over differing interpretations. So that's where we battle out. That's where we have the anarchic wars of formation, where we battle out who rules over who. And number 3, rightful ownership, basically ratifying rightful ownership through the NAP. So then once the wars have ended, then whoever has grabbed whatever territory and they have solidified their control over that territory, that's their territory. All right.
No, man, come on. You know what the non-aggression principle is, and ratifying ownership through the non-aggression principle obviously doesn't mean wars and violence and all of that sort of thing. The non-aggression principle is a principle that says you own yourself and you can't aggress against people. So rightful ownership that's ratified by the non-aggression principle is ownership that you've acquired without coercion through creation or voluntary trade. It's not ownership where you that you acquired through wars and violent conquest and stuff like that. So you should know that. I mean, you know what the non-aggression principle is. So if I say that part 3 is about ratifying ratifying rightful ownership through the non-aggression principle, it should be pretty obvious to you that I am not talking about wars and people using violence and stuff like that. I'm talking about using the non-aggression principle to ratify people's rightful ownership. So we can say this person owns that because they didn't steal it. They didn't use force or coercion. They acquired it through peaceful methods. They either created it themselves or they voluntarily traded for it or some kind of combination of that. So yeah, and the same goes with part 1 and part 2. You know, like I say, this is a peace agreement. It's not a declaration of war. Although saying that, you could argue that it is kind of a declaration of war against anybody that wants to violate people's self-ownership and go against the non-aggression principle, including ruling governments. But as I say, as they're the aggressors, we're not aggressing against them. This is, this is a declaration of our will to defend ourselves, and this is how we are defining freedom. This is how we are defining people's freedom. We're saying everybody has right to themselves and no one has the right to rule over people or aggress against people or violate them in any way. That's how we define freedom, and that's the freedom that belongs to everybody in equal measure. Okay, so I've covered what Brandon had to say in his first two videos. These are now clips from his third and final video that he did. As I say, I did do a comment replying to this video, but I haven't had any response from Brandon on that. So I will obviously go through what I responded and any other elaborations. And I'm very hopeful that we can arrange a discussion or a debate, me and Brandon, because I think, you know, we can clarify these things further and get a better understanding of where we're both coming from, and obviously debate any issues that we disagree on. So that is something I'm hoping to get arranged very soon. But in the meantime, as I say, you've got the three videos that Brandon has done, which you can check out. The links are in the description. And obviously this is my video trying to address all the points that he made. If there's anything you think I've missed, please let me know. That goes to Brandon and to anybody else watching.
Seeing as you called it officially the stupidest sentence you've ever heard, I will first address my statement that laws are basically the terms of peace. Now, if laws are basically the terms of peace, then drop that three-word phrase and just go for the one-word term. Why would you have three words when you can replace it with one word? What does it clarify to add three words to replace one word with three words? What are you clarifying? Whether you say that the prohibition against initiating force against others is the law, or whether you say it is the terms of peace, you're essentially saying the same thing. Okay, checkmark, QED, stop saying terms of peace, just say law. Terms of peace is three words that are more confusing than one word, which is law. Just say law. If you violate the law, if you violate the terms of peace, then you are breaking the rules that dictate when you should be left alone or when force can or should be used against you.
Okay, so I think I've made the case there for why you can refer to law or describe law as the terms of peace, why that works as a definition. But Brandon's problem is, well, why am I saying terms of peace? Why don't I just use the term law? And I'm just going to read out my reply to him that I put in the comment section of his video, probably with a little bit of additional commentary. So what I said was, calling it the terms of peace serves two purposes. One, further defining and clarifying what law is, as it would be redundant and unhelpful to just define law as law. So, you know, I want to get everybody on the same page of understanding what law actually is. And, you know, saying law is law isn't very helpful as a description. So saying law is the terms of peace just serves as another description of what law is, and just make sure that we're all on the same page as to what we're talking about here. I have no problem saying law. But yes, Brandon is right when he suggests that one of the reasons why I veer away from the word law and prefer the terms of peace method is because a lot of anarchists do recoil at the word law. A lot of people have a misunderstanding. I mean, the fact of the matter is law has only ever been established through a ruling authority. So a lot of people have a problem in divorcing law from a ruling government. They sort of feel like if you've got one, you have to have the other. And I'm just trying to point out, well, that's not the only way to establish law. And because law is basically just the terms of peace, yes, it can be established through a ruling government, which is how it is established in today's world, but it can also be established through a peace agreement. And either way, you're achieving the same thing. But as I said, if you want to establish the non-aggression principles law and make that a universal law, then you can't establish it through a ruling government because ruling governments violate the non-aggression principle. You could only establish it as the terms of a peace agreement.
It's usually laid out by a ruling authority, like a government or a monarch, but it can also be established as the terms of peace. Law is usually laid out by a ruling authority, like a government. But different from law, or different from being set out by a ruling authority, that's what it is. Law is usually done in this way, but can also be established as the terms of peace. Now we're getting down to your point of what the terms of peace means. So the terms of peace means something that can be laid out like law but without a government. Okay. The terms of peace is usually laid out by an authority or a government, but can also be established as the terms of peace. The law is usually laid out by an authority, but can also be established as the terms of peace. Now, either the terms of peace means law without government, and what would that be? What would law without government even mean? Boy, you are confused, dude. You need to define what the terms of peace means. You are using it there as a different thing from law. And how it is different from law is that law is laid out by a ruling authority or government, but the terms of peace is different. You separate it with the words can also be. And the word also is your only operative thought in that sentence. Also. You just say, comma, this as well. You don't tell me why or how or what is different about it. So that's really crappy thinking, dude. That sentence is really, really crappy, dude. Come on.
Okay, I probably should have said can also be established as the terms of a peace agreement. But basically what I'm talking about here is law, whether it's established by a ruling authority or whether it's established through this peace agreement, either way, law can be described as the terms of peace. Whether it's a ruling government that's saying this is a law or this is the terms of peace to its citizenry, it's saying the same thing, which is why I say law and terms of peace are interchangeable. You are talking about the same thing here. And that's true whether it's laid down by a ruling government or whether it's laid down through a peace agreement. So I'm not saying that law and terms of peace are different things. I'm talking about how you establish them. You can either establish the law or the terms of peace through a ruling government that establishes it, saying, we're the rulers and we're saying that this is the law, or we're the rulers and we're saying this is the terms of peace. Like I say, either way, it's the same. So I'm talking about how you establish it. It's either way, it's the law, or either way, it's the terms of peace. It's the same thing. But if you establish it through a peace agreement, then how you're establishing it isn't through a ruling authority. You're actually establishing it as the terms of peace, or more specifically, as the terms of a peace agreement. So yeah, my sentence probably wasn't the best there, but hopefully I've clarified what I'm talking about there. Law can be described as the terms of peace, whether it's established through a ruling government or through a peace agreement. But obviously, if it's established through a ruling government, then that's how the law's been established, under their authority as rulers. Whereas if it's established through a peace agreement, then it's not being established under the authority of any rulers. It's being established as terms of peace, more specifically, the terms of a peace agreement. I hope I've made that clear.
I realize the phrase is usually used in the context of peace treaties between warring tribes or nations, but in this case, I want to use it as a vehicle for establishing the NAP as the terms of peace, which is essentially the same as making universal law. So I realize that this terminology is usually used elsewhere, but in this case, I want to use it to make a universal law. Now, how is your universal law from the universal law that we have already, except what? Property taxes? Taxation? Is that the only difference? So why don't you just work to change the taxation system? What's your big to-do about if you're just going to have a universal law that everyone has to follow regardless of whether or not they agree in it, and in this new system you won't have forced taxation? Then why don't you just work towards getting rid of forced taxation? What is your big thing with universal law? What is that?
Okay, this is another one of those times where I just want to say, come on, man. You should know this. You know that what the non-aggression principle is. So can you really not think of any other difference between a law that only enforces the non-aggression principle and the law that we have today, other than property taxes? Is taxation the only thing you can see that's different? Surely you can think of a few other differences. I mean, to help you out here, If the law was just enforcing the non-aggression principle, there'd be no drug laws, there'd be no gambling laws, there'd be no prostitution laws, there'd be no law of any kind that interferes with the activities of consenting adults. Ruling governments would be illegal as ruling entities because it would be illegal to rule people. So governments would have to convert into some kind of voluntary collective that leads with the consent of the people that it's leading. And would not be allowed to rule over anybody or violate their rights in any kind of way. So, these are pretty big differences. Obviously, I do understand the similarities between a non-aggression principle law and the laws that we have today. For example, rape would still be illegal, just as it is today. Murder would be illegal, just as it is today. Theft would be illegal, just as it is today, etc., etc. But every single law that exists that goes beyond just enforcing the non-aggression principle essentially violates the non-aggression principle, because law is force, and if you're using force to enforce the non-aggression principle, then you're using force defensively. If you're using force for anything else, then you're aggressing, and therefore you're violating the non-aggression principle. So I know we like to say there's no such thing as stupid questions, but to be frank, that's kind of a stupid question. Coming from you, at least. If it was from somebody who had no idea what the non-aggression principle was, then that would be a fair question. But I've seen enough of Brandon's videos to know that he has a reasonable understanding of what the non-aggression principle is. So it seems a little bit absurd that the only difference he could see between a non-aggression principle law and the law we have today is that property taxes would go. I mean, for one thing, all taxes would go, unless we can introduce some kind of voluntary alternative to taxation, although I would argue that then it wouldn't be taxation if it was voluntary, just like a government wouldn't be a government if it wasn't ruling people and if that was a voluntary organization. So maybe some of this stuff is how we're defining words, and again, this is, and just harkening back to why I say terms of peace as well as law instead of just saying law. This is because not everybody has the exact precise understanding of every word. So I like to elaborate on my descriptions and definitions just to make sure people have a proper understanding of what I'm talking about. And my concern is if I just say law, then people won't have a full grasp of what I'm talking about. Whereas if I talk about law and also talk about terms of peace and explain that I'm basically talking about the same thing, then the idea is that gives people a better understanding of what I'm talking about. So whether it's right or wrong, that is my motivation for why I'm interchanging here and using more than one word to describe things, because I'm trying to make sure that people have a proper understanding of what I'm talking about.
To basically recognize self-ownership or self-rule, or whatever term you prefer to describe the fact that you have a right over yourself and only yourself. How about freedom? Does freedom work for you? Self-ownership is 2 words. Self-rule is 2 words. Freedom is 1 word. It's a clearer concept. Why can't you use the word freedom? You have a right to yourself and only to yourself. That's freedom. Everyone has that right. That's why you don't have a right to anybody else, because they have freedom too. Freedom is the word you're looking for, dude. Come on.
Freedom works fine for me. It seems like one area where me and Brandon do seem to be in agreement is that is the definition of freedom. When I talk about self-ownership or self-rule, the sort of freedom that everyone can have equally, then yeah, that is how I define freedom. And it seems to be how Brandon defines freedom as well. So looks like we've got a bit of common ground there. The reason why I don't just use that word and I talk about self-ownership or self-rule and things like that is because even though freedom works for me, it doesn't work for everybody else. I've spoken to enough idiots who seem to think that freedom includes the freedom to violate others. I've literally spoken to somebody who claimed that law against rape is a violation of their freedom because their freedom includes the freedom to rape. I mean, I tried pointing out that the freedom I'm talking about and how I define freedom is a freedom that everybody has. Therefore, you can't have the freedom to rape because you're violating somebody else's freedom over their own body. But unfortunately, there are enough people in this world that don't have a good understanding of freedom. So although I am happy to use the word freedom to describe what I'm talking about, And obviously, I can use that word when speaking to someone like Brandon because he's got a proper understanding of freedom. But when I speak to other people, it's not so clear. And so again, I just need to be clarifying. So when I say freedom, I don't just say freedom. I also say self-rule. I also talk about self-ownership. I also talk about freedom in the context of being a universalizable principle that can be, that everyone can have an equal measure. Everyone has equal claim to this freedom. Just like I say, just to clarify what I'm talking about. It's exactly the same as why I talk about terms of peace as well as law when I'm describing basically the same thing. I'll also speak about self-ownership or self-rule or your right to yourself and only yourself when I'm talking about freedom. And even though I'm quite happy to use the word freedom, the fact of the matter is I'm not 100% convinced that people will be 100% on board with what I'm talking about. So just to sort of get in front of any potential confusions, and to make sure I'm not talking to somebody who seems to think that freedom includes the right to violate others, I clarify that I'm talking about self-ownership, self-rule, and freedom in that context. Freedom that everybody has in equal measure. So yeah, freedom works for me fine. But that is why I do use other words as well, just to make sure other people are understanding what I'm talking about.
We can live in peace if we respect this basic right of every individual. True, but some people don't, and therefore we have courts and laws and police officers. That's what the NAP is about. Why? Why would you do the NAP? We have police officers and law right now. And that's why the idea is to replace the rule of government. Like I said, this guy is 3 inches from the FBI knocking on his door and saying, "Excuse me, sir, we heard that you are starting an insurrection against the United States government." Now, I wouldn't be fond of that because I don't think he's going to come up with a constitution better than the one we have, with the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I don't think he's going to come up with anything nearly as good as that, not with his fucking junk thinking about universal law, non-aggression principle. What is it? With universal law? What was the term? It's so stupid I can't even remember the term.
Now, I think that's basically it with regards to me addressing the points that Brandon made in his 3 videos. As I say, I'm putting links to these videos in the description, so people are welcome to check out Brandon's videos. And obviously, if there's anything you think I've missed, any questions you think I've not answered, then please let me know, and I'll try to get on that. One other thing I want to talk about before I conclude this video is, in addition to the 3 videos that Brandon did speaking to me specifically, I've watched a few of his other videos, but there was a particular video that he pointed me in the direction of, which was regarding what he calls the objectivist state. Now, the thing that confused me a little bit about this video is, this is another reason why I'd like to speak to Brandon, because I'd like to clarify some of these things with him, but Brandon's obviously been very mocking of my idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as law through a peace agreement. And he seemed to be quite contemptuous of both the idea of the peace agreement and also the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as universal law. However, in the video where Brandon speaks about his objectivist state, he seems to be advocating for a very similar idea, in the sense that he wants to create a state that only enforces the non-aggression principle, seemingly as law. I mean, he doesn't word it that way. He talks about a state that would protect people's rights, but I'm pretty sure he's talking about negative rights, people's rights of self-ownership, that freedom that we both seem to agree on the definition of. Now, if this objectivist state of his is only enforcing the non-aggression principle, only protecting people's rights, then that is basically very similar to what I'm trying to do through this peace agreement, which is have the non-aggression principle be the law. I'm not trying to do it through a ruling government because, as I said before, ruling governments are violations of the non-aggression principle. So there's an obvious contradiction in establishing the non-aggression principle as law when you've got this giant entity doing that, but is also violating the non-aggression principle, if by no other way than the fact that they're a ruling entity and they're claiming that authority over people. So I want to clarify with Brandon a little bit more about this objectivist state idea that he has, I suspect that the reason why he's calling it a state is because it does have some level of authority to rule over people, which would violate the non-aggression principle. So maybe that is the way in which it is different from my idea. But he seems to have the same goal as me with regards to creating a world where people's rights are protected in equal measure. And those rights seem to be defined in the same way of self-ownership, self-rule, or freedom, as we would both define it. So that's an area that I'd like to clarify with Brandon, because he's been quite mocking of my idea, and maybe his problem is mostly with the idea of establishing it as terms of peace rather than the idea of enforcing the non-aggression principle as law. But his idea does seem to also be about enforcing the non-aggression principle as law, even though there does seem to be a bit of a contradiction with the ruling government part. As I say, I have extended an invitation to Brandon to have a debate, and Brandon has also expressed an interest in having a debate. So we haven't arranged a date for that as yet, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to relatively soon, and maybe we can come to a better understanding of where we both come from. But in the meantime, I hope this video serves as a adequate response to Brandon and to the points that he made and the questions that he asked. And in the meantime, I will try to arrange a debate with Brandon so that we can discuss this further. Thank you for listening.